At about 7:10 in the evening on the 10th of November, 1975, a radio operator on a ship in a storm on Lake Superior called across to another ship a few miles behind him and asked a routine question. "How are you making out with your problems?" The answer came back in 4 words, in a completely calm voice. "We are holding our own." That is the last thing anybody ever heard from the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Within about 10 minutes she was gone from the radar screen of the ship behind her. There was no distress call, no flare, no lifeboat launched under power, and no survivor. 29 men went down with her in about 530 feet of water. And here is the part that surprises people. This is not an old mystery from an age before instruments. This happened in 1975. There was another ship watching her on radar. There is a recorded log of the radio traffic. The wreck was found within 3 days and has been photographed extensively. And the United States Coast Guard, after a 2-year investigation, could not establish what sank her. Worse than that. The Coast Guard published a probable cause, and the association representing the shipowners formally rejected it, in writing, and filed a dissent. That does not usually happen. It is one thing for a cause to be unknown. It is another for the investigators and the industry to end up publicly disagreeing about what they were looking at. There are 3 real explanations and they are still argued about today, 50 years later, by people who know these ships. One of them says the crew left the hatches unfastened. One says she tore her bottom open on a shoal nobody had charted properly. And one says a wave hit her that was bigger than anything the design allowed for. To understand any of it you have to understand what she was, and what she was is not what most people picture when they hear the word shipwreck. The Edmund Fitzgerald was 729 feet long, 222 meters. When she was launched in 1958 she was the largest ship on the Great Lakes, and she held that title for 13 years. She was longer than the Titanic was wide by a factor of 8, and she was built to do one thing extremely well, carry iron ore. She was owned by an insurance company, Northwestern Mutual Life, which built her as an investment and named her after its chairman, and operated under contract by a shipping firm. That detail matters later, when we get to who was responsible for what. On the lakes she was famous. Crews called her the Big Fitz. She set seasonal hull records repeatedly through the 60s. She had a working public address system and a licensed captain who gave commentary to passengers on the occasional guest trip. She was, in the phrase people used at the time, the pride of the American side. Her captain on the last voyage was Ernest McSorley. He was 63 years old, he had been at sea since he was 18, he had commanded ships on the lakes for decades, and he was planning to retire at the end of that season. 29 men were aboard. Deckhands, engineers, wheelsmen, cooks, a porter, 3 mates. The youngest was 20. The oldest was 63, and he was the captain. It is worth saying who the 29 were, because the number on its own does the same thing every number does, it makes them abstract. They came from Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Florida, California. There were 3 watchmen, 3 wheelsmen, 2 oilers, a porter, 2 cooks, 3 deckhands, 4 engineers, 3 mates, and the captain. Several had sailed together for years. 2 were on their first trip. The youngest was 20. The second engineer had a wife and children waiting for him in Ohio. One of the deckhands had joined the ship a few weeks earlier as a temporary replacement. The captain was retiring at the end of the season and this was meant to be one of his last runs. None of them were recovered. That is not unusual on Lake Superior, and there is a physical reason for it that people on the lakes have known for generations. In salt water, bodies eventually surface. In fresh water at 4 degrees, the bacterial processes that produce that buoyancy do not occur. Lake Superior does not give up her dead. What she carried is central to everything that follows, so it is worth a minute. Taconite. It is low-grade iron ore, crushed, concentrated, and rolled into pellets about the size of marbles so it can be poured and handled like grain. Each pellet is roughly 60% iron. On that voyage she was carrying 26,000 long tons of it. That cargo has two properties that matter. It is dense, so it sits low and takes up less volume than you would expect, which leaves a great deal of empty space in the hold above it. And it is not watertight. Water poured into a hold full of taconite does not sit on top of it. It goes down between the pellets and stays there, invisible from the deck. Hold on to that. A ship taking on water in a taconite hold does not look like a ship taking on water. She just gets slowly heavier and slower to come back up when a wave pushes her down. The route was routine and she had run it hundreds of times. Load at Superior, Wisconsin, at the western end of Lake Superior. Run east the length of the lake, about 350 miles. Through the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, down through Lake Huron, and into Detroit, where the ore went to a steel mill. There is also a history to November on these lakes that everybody sailing them knew about, and it is worth 1 minute because it explains why nobody thought the forecast was unusual. In November 1913 a storm sat over the Great Lakes for 4 days. Sailors called it the Big Blow. 12 ships were lost with all hands. More than 250 people died in under a week. Ships were found floating upside down, still afloat, with their crews inside them. Between 1913 and 1975 the lakes took ships regularly, and always in the same season. There is a reason it clusters. Through the summer the lakes absorb heat, by November the water is still warm while Arctic air is arriving overhead, and that temperature difference is fuel. Storms that would be ordinary elsewhere become violent over that water. So a storm warning in November was not a shock to anybody. Ships sailed in November because the season ended in December and every trip counted. What was unusual about the 10th of November, 1975, was not that there was a storm. It was how big it got, and how fast. It is worth saying what Lake Superior actually is, because people hear the word lake and picture something you can see across. Superior is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area. It is 350 miles long. It holds enough water to cover both North and South America to a depth of a foot. It has its own weather. And it is cold. Even in November the water sits a few degrees above freezing. That single fact shapes everything about survival on that lake, because it means that going into the water is not a setback. It is the end. She loaded at Superior on the afternoon of the 9th of November, 1975, and sailed at about 2:15. She was not alone. Another ore carrier, the Arthur M. Anderson, sailed a couple of hours later on the same route with a different cargo. The two captains agreed by radio to keep company across the lake, which on the lakes means staying in contact and roughly in sight, because the weather forecast was bad. That decision is why we know anything at all about what happened. Without the Anderson, the Edmund Fitzgerald would simply have failed to arrive, and this would be a story with no witnesses. November on the Great Lakes has a reputation and it is entirely earned. The lakes are still warm from summer while the air above them turns cold, and that difference feeds storms. Sailors call the worst of them the November gales, and there is a long list of ships that went down in them. By the evening of the 9th, the National Weather Service had upgraded from gale warnings to storm warnings for all of Lake Superior. Both captains knew. Both decided to run the northern route along the Canadian shore, which offered shelter from the worst of it. That was a reasonable, standard decision by two experienced men. What arrived over the next 24 hours was not an ordinary November gale. Modern reanalysis of that storm, and these are the images you're looking at, produced by American weather scientists modeling the conditions from the recorded data, put sustained winds across the eastern lake at over 50 knots, gusting far higher. The Anderson recorded gusts of about 86 knots. That is 100 miles an hour. The waves were the real problem. Reported significant wave heights ran to 25 feet, with individual waves considerably larger. And Great Lakes waves are not ocean waves, fresh water is less dense, the lake is shallower, and the waves come closer together. A ship on the lakes gets hit more often, from a shorter distance, with less time to recover between. That last point is not a detail. A 700-foot ship in ocean swell rides over the waves. The same ship in a steep lake sea can be supported at the bow and the stern with nothing under the middle, or supported in the middle with both ends hanging. Naval architects call those hogging and sagging, and a hull built for one gets tested hard by the other. Before we get to the afternoon, there is a piece of background that almost never gets mentioned and that several serious analysts consider central. It is about how deeply she was allowed to load. Every merchant ship has a load line, a mark on the hull showing the maximum depth she may legally be loaded to. Below that mark you have less freeboard, which is the distance from the waterline up to the deck. Less freeboard means water comes aboard more often and more heavily. In 1969, and again in 1971, and again in 1973, the load line rules applying to Great Lakes carriers were revised, and the Fitzgerald was permitted to load progressively deeper than she had been when she was built. By 1975 she could legally sit around 3 feet lower in the water than her original 1958 marks allowed. 3 feet does not sound like much. On a ship that size it is thousands of tons of extra cargo per trip, and it is 3 feet less of hull between the lake and the deck when a 25-foot wave arrives. The Coast Guard approved those changes and the Coast Guard also investigated the sinking. That is not an accusation of anything, the changes were made openly, on the basis of engineering submissions, and applied across the fleet. But it is a fact worth holding when you read a finding that puts the cause on how the crew fastened the hatches. She also had a history. Over her 17 years she had run aground, been in collisions, and lost hatch covers. In the early 1970s inspections recorded loose keel plates and hull cracks that were repaired. Again, routine for a working or carrier of that age. Again, worth knowing. The first sign of trouble came in the afternoon of the 10th, and it came from McSorley himself, by radio, in a completely level voice. At about 3:30 he called the Anderson and reported damage. A fence rail was down. 2 vents were lost or damaged. And the ship had a list. Take those one at a time, because each one means something. A fence rail is a safety railing on deck. Losing one means water is coming over the deck hard enough to tear off steel. Vents are how the cargo holds breathe, a damaged vent is a hole into the hold. And a list means she was already carrying weight on one side that she should not have been carrying. McSorley also said he was slowing down to let the Anderson close up behind him. That is a significant thing for a captain to do. It means he wanted company. Then, later, a second call. Both of the Fitzgerald's radars had failed. In a storm, at night, in a lake with shoals in it, McSorley was now navigating blind, and he asked the Anderson to provide him with navigational plots. The Anderson did, for hours, calling out his position relative to theirs. Think about that arrangement for a moment. A 700-foot ship, in a 100-mile-an-hour storm, at night, being talked toward shelter over the radio by another ship several miles astern, using their radar because his own was gone. And through all of it, according to everybody who spoke to him, McSorley sounded calm. There is no panic anywhere in the record. There is a captain managing a bad situation and heading for shelter behind Whitefish Point. Whitefish Point is a hook of land at the eastern end of Lake Superior with a lighthouse and a radio beacon on it, and behind it is Whitefish Bay, the one piece of sheltered water on that end of the lake. Every ship caught in that storm was running for it. Get behind Whitefish Point and the seas drop away. It is the difference between fighting for your life and riding it out. And there was a problem with that too. The light and the radio beacon at Whitefish Point were out. The power was down. McSorley called and asked whether they were working, and was told they were not. So the one navigational aid he was steering for, with no radar of his own, was dark. She never got there. When she disappeared she was about 17 miles short of Whitefish Point, close enough that on a clear night the crew would have been able to see the light. Here is the sequence at the end, as reconstructed from the Anderson's own log and the testimony of her crew. At about 7:10, the Andersons' first mate called across to ask how they were making out with their problems. McSorley answered, "We are holding our own." There was nothing else. No follow-up. The conversation just ended normally. A short time later a snow squall came through and blotted out visibility. When it cleared, the Anderson could see the lights of 3 ships far ahead near Whitefish, and could not see the Fitzgerald, which had been much closer. They checked the radar. She was not on it. They called her. Nothing. They called again on another channel. Nothing. They called other vessels to ask if anybody had her. Nobody did. The Anderson's captain, Bernie Cooper, then had to call the Coast Guard and say something that he clearly found difficult, because he kept qualifying it. He said he was afraid he had lost her. He said he could be wrong. He asked them to check. Then Cooper did something that deserves recording. His own ship had been badly beaten by the same storm. He had every reason to make for shelter. Instead, after reaching Whitefish Bay, he turned the Anderson around and took her back out into it to search. Other ships joined. Coast Guard aircraft came out. They searched all night and through the next day. They found 2 damaged lifeboats, some life rafts, life rings, and floating debris. They found no bodies, and they never have. In water that cold, bodies do not surface. The search itself produced a criticism that has never entirely gone away, and it is worth putting on the record. When the Fitzgerald went missing there was no Coast Guard vessel anywhere near her. The nearest cutter capable of working in that sea was hours away, and the one that eventually reached the area took the better part of a day to get there from Duluth. The immediate search was carried out by commercial or carriers, turning around in a storm because there was nobody else. Captain Cooper of the Anderson said afterwards, publicly and repeatedly, that the response was inadequate, that he had been asked to turn his own ship back into a storm that had nearly destroyed her, because the service whose job it was could not get there. It should be said in fairness that no rescue was possible in those seas by anybody, and that nobody on the Fitzgerald was alive to be rescued. But the point Cooper was making was about capability, not about that night. Search and rescue coverage on the lakes was thin, and everybody in the industry knew it. It is worth spending a moment on what the Anderson herself went through that night, because she is the control experiment. Same storm, same water, same hours, a few miles apart. The Anderson was hit hard. Her crew described seas breaking over the whole length of the ship, water pouring down into the after cabins, and a roll so severe that men were thrown off their feet. She lost a radar antenna and took damage on deck. And she came through it. That is the fact that keeps the argument alive. 2 war carriers of similar size, in the same seas, within a few miles of each other. One survived with damage. The other went down in under 10 minutes without a word. Whatever the difference was, it was specific to the Fitzgerald that night. Finding the wreck took 3 days, which by the standards of this channel is essentially instant. A Navy aircraft flew the area with a magnetometer, an instrument that detects distortions in the Earth's magnetic field caused by large masses of iron. A 700-foot steel ship full of iron ore is about the largest magnetic anomaly you could ask for. They found her on the 14th of November. She was lying in 530 feet of water, in Canadian waters, about 17 miles from Whitefish Point. The following May, the Coast Guard brought in a remotely operated vehicle and photographed the site over several days. And what those photographs showed is the thing that has kept the argument alive ever since. She is in 2 pieces. The bow section, about 270 feet of it, is sitting upright on the bottom, embedded in the sediment, roughly as if she had been set down. The stern section, about 250 feet, is lying upside down, 170 feet away, facing the opposite direction. Between them is a field of taconite pellets and twisted steel. Now here is the question that has occupied naval architects for 50 years. Did she break in two on the surface, in which case something failed structurally, or did she go down whole, nose first, hit the bottom while her stern was still up in the water, and break there? That matters enormously. If she broke on the surface, the cause is structural failure and the hull is to blame. If she broke on the bottom, then she was still in one piece when she went under, which means she sank because she filled with water, and the question becomes where the water came from. The wreck is in 530 feet of water. The ship was 729 feet long. She was longer than the water was deep. If she went down at a steep angle, her bow reached the bottom while a substantial part of her was still in the water above, and everything after that would come down onto a hull that had already stopped. That single geometric fact is the strongest argument that the break happened at the bottom, and it is why most analysts now think she went under intact. Before the theories, one more thing about the hatches, because the design matters and it is usually described wrongly. These were not small doors. Each cover was a single piece of steel weighing several tons, lifted on and off by a shore crane during loading. The seal was made by the weight of the cover onto a gasket, and the clamps were there to hold it down against the pressure of water trying to lift it from below. That detail is the heart of the industry objection. If a cover is that heavy, a partly clamped hatch does not simply fall open. It leaks, and the argument is about whether leakage of that kind could put enough water into a hold in a few hours to sink her, or whether you need something much more sudden. Both sides have run the numbers and both sides can make their number work. Which is a familiar situation by now on this channel. The evidence does not adjudicate, so the argument moves to assumptions, and people choose assumptions that fit what they already believe. So, where did the water come from? Theory 1, and the official one, is the hatches. An ore carrier has a row of enormous hatches along the deck, on the Fitzgerald, 21 of them, each about 11 by 50 feet. They are closed with steel covers, and each cover is held down by a set of clamps that have to be fastened by hand, one at a time, by crew walking the deck. There were 68 clamps per hatch. The Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation concluded that the probable cause was massive flooding of the cargo hold through those hatch covers, that they were not properly fastened, that they leaked progressively through the storm, and that the taconite quietly took on water until she no longer had the buoyancy to come back up out of a wave. It is a coherent explanation and it fits several things. It fits the list McSorley reported. It fits the fact that she gave no warning, because a ship flooding through her hatches into taconite gives no visible warning until the moment she does not come back up. And it fits the absence of a distress call, because there was nothing to send one about until it was over. It also has a serious problem, and it is not a technical one. It puts the cause on the crew, specifically on men who were doing the fastening, all of whom died. Nobody survived to say what had or had not been done, and the finding rests on inference about the actions of dead men. Which is why what happened next is so unusual. The Lake Carriers Association, the body representing the shipping companies that operate on the lakes, formally rejected the Coast Guard's conclusion and filed a written dissent. They argued that the hatch finding was not supported by the evidence, and that experienced crews on a ship in a known storm would have secured the hatches as a matter of routine. You should read that with some care, because it cuts both ways. The association had an obvious interest in the cause not being a maintenance and procedure failure aboard a member vessel. But the men who signed it were also the people who actually knew how these ships were run, and their objection was specific rather than general. The National Transportation Safety Board reviewed it separately and broadly supported the flooding conclusion, but even there, one board member dissented, arguing for a sudden massive flooding from a hull fracture rather than progressive leakage through the hatches. So the official record on the Edmund Fitzgerald is not one conclusion. It is a probable cause, an industry rejection of it, a second federal agency broadly agreeing, and a dissent inside that agency too. 4 positions, from people who all had the same evidence. Theory 2 is the one the shipowners favored, and it has a specific location attached to it. North of Whitefish Point there is a shallow area called 6 Fathom Shoal. Captain Cooper of the Anderson stated afterwards that he believed the Fitzgerald had passed closer to it than was safe, and that in those seas, with the ship pitching, she could have struck it. The argument gets sharper because of the charts. Surveys after the sinking found that the shoal extended further than the chart in use at the time showed. If a captain navigating without radar was steering by a chart that understated the hazard, then striking it is not carelessness, it is being given the wrong information. A grounding would explain the list, the damage, and the flooding, and it would put the cause on a chart rather than on the crew, which is exactly why the shipowners preferred it and exactly why you should notice that they did. The evidence against it is the wreck itself. Surveys have not found the kind of bottom damage you would expect from a ship of that size dragging over rock, though the bow is embedded in sediment, and the part of the hull where that damage would be is the part nobody can see. Theory 3 is the simplest of the 3 and the hardest to prove, a wave. Sailors on the lakes have talked for a very long time about what they call the 3 sisters, a sequence of 3 unusually large waves arriving together, where the first 2 put water on the deck and the third arrives before it has drained off. For most of the 20th century that was treated as folklore. It is not folklore anymore. Rogue waves have been measured and confirmed by instruments since the 1990s, and modeling shows that in a steep confused sea they occur more often than the older statistics predicted. And the Anderson reported exactly this. Her crew described 2 enormous waves that came over the stern, buried the after cabins, and then rolled on ahead of them, in the direction of the Fitzgerald, at about the right time. Cooper said so in his testimony. That is as close to an eyewitness account of the mechanism as this case will ever produce. It is also, in the end, unprovable, because a wave leaves no evidence at all once it has passed. Something did change afterwards, and this is the part of the story that is genuinely positive. Within a few years of the sinking, the rules for Great Lakes shipping were rewritten. Survival suits became mandatory aboard. Depth finders were required. Positioning and emergency beacons were required. Hatch inspection intervals were tightened, and the load line increases of the early 1970s were revisited. The wider result is the one that matters. Since 1975 there has not been another loss of that kind on the Great Lakes. 50 years, thousands of transits a season, and no ore carrier lost with all hands. That is what usually happens after a disaster like this, and it is worth saying plainly because it is easy to lose in the mystery. The Edmund Fitzgerald is the reason a great many people who sail those lakes today go home at the end of the season. There is one more part of this story, and it is the reason a lot of people know the name at all. The memorial services began almost immediately and they have never stopped. At the Mariners Church in Detroit, the rector heard the news on the radio and rang the church bell 29 times, once for each man. That has been repeated every year since, in a service that families still attend. At Whitefish Point, where the museum is, the recovered bell is rung on the anniversary, 29 times for the crew, and then a 30th time for everyone else lost on the Great Lakes. There are somewhere around 6,000 wrecks in those lakes and an estimated 30,000 dead across 2 centuries. In 1976, a few months after she went down, a Canadian folk singer named Gordon Lightfoot recorded a 6.5-minute song about it. He had read a magazine article, been annoyed that the men had been described as a crew rather than as people, and written it in a few days. It went to number 2 in the United States. That song is why a shipwreck on a lake in 1975 is still a household name in North America 50 years later, and it is the reason the families of those 29 men have never had to explain who they were talking about. And there is a small human detail about that song that says a great deal, and it happened much later. The original lyric contains a line saying that at 7 p.m. a main hatchway caved in, which is the Coast Guard version, the one that puts the cause on the hatches, and therefore on the crew. It was written in 1976 when that was the official finding. Decades later, after seeing a documentary that argued the crew had been unfairly blamed, Gordon Lightfoot changed the line. In live performances and later releases he sang that a rogue wave came in instead. He said publicly that he had done it out of respect for the families. A songwriter revising a 30-year-old hit because he no longer believed one line was fair to 29 dead men is not evidence about what sank the ship. But it tells you how live this argument has stayed, and who it has stayed live for. In 1995, at the request of the families, an expedition went down and recovered the ship's bell. It was cleaned and put on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, the place she never reached. And in its place on the wreck they left a replica bell, engraved with the names of the 29 men. Canada has since restricted diving on the site. It is a grave, and it is treated as one. There is one more thing about this case that separates it from the others on this channel, and it is about how close the evidence came to being complete. In 1994 and 1995 there were expeditions to the wreck with submersibles and remote vehicles. In 1995 2 divers, using experimental gas mixtures, went down to the hull on scuba, the only human beings who have ever touched the Edmund Fitzgerald since she sank. They were on the bottom for a few minutes. Everything that has been learned about the wreck comes from a handful of visits like that, made at the edge of what is survivable, in cold dark water, looking at a hull that is mostly buried in mud. The bow is embedded up to the anchor. The section of hull where the answer would be, the bottom plating, is the part that is under the ship. So we have the storm modeled to the hour, the radio traffic transcribed, an eyewitness vessel a few miles away, the wreck located within 3 days and visited repeatedly, and the physical evidence that would settle it is lying face down in the sediment of a lake, and has been since 1975. So here is what the evidence supports, and where it stops. On the evening of the 10th of November, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was making for shelter in the worst storm of that decade on Lake Superior, with a list, with damaged vents, with both radars out, being navigated by another ship over the radio. She was 17 miles from safety. Her captain said he was holding his own, and about 10 minutes later she was gone from the radar without a word. She almost certainly went under intact and broke on the bottom, because she was longer than the water was deep. She almost certainly sank because she had taken on more water than she could carry. Where that water came from is the part that has never been settled, and the official record contains 4 different positions on it. And there is one detail that stays with me more than any of the theories. Nobody sent a distress call. Not because there was no time to reach a radio, McSorley had been on that radio all afternoon. But because, 10 minutes before the end, the man in command of that ship believed he was managing it. If you want more case files, they are on this channel. A nuclear submarine that vanished with 99 men while a microphone 1,000 miles away recorded it happening, an airship that burned in 32 seconds with no inquiry able to name the spark, a colony of 115 people who took their own houses apart and walked away. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments which one you would put your money on. 1. The hatches. 2. The shoal. 3. The waves.